Daniel Cole stood in a boardroom that smelled like fresh carpet glue, listening to a 28-year-old tell him his position was being restructured for efficiency. Nobody in the room could hold his eyes for more than a second. A box was already waiting outside the door, packed by someone else, taped shut before he'd even been asked to sit down. He nodded once, picked it up, and walked past 6 people who used to call him at midnight when something broke that only he understood. 3 weeks from now, every elevator. The trouble started the way trouble usually does at a company like Ferris, quietly, and to someone who didn't yet understand what he was looking at. Marcus Ferris, 30 months into running the company his father had built and 4 months into running it alone, stood in the operations center watching a diagnostic panel throw the same warning 3 times in an hour. A safety interlock fault on Tower 4, cleared each time by a reset nobody understood, returning each time a little worse. "It's a sensor glitch," he told the floor supervisor, "the way people say things once they've already decided to believe them because the alternative takes more effort than they're prepared to spend." He had signed off on Daniel's termination 6 days earlier, one line on a headcount memo his COO had put in front of him between 2 other meetings, an efficiency measure, she'd called it, trimming a technician's salary that looked disproportionate to the title on file. Her name was Renata Kessler, and she had been angling for 18 months to move portfolio maintenance to an outside vendor she had a quiet financial stake in, a contract that would only make sense on paper once the in-house team looked expensive and replaceable. Daniel Cole, whose actual pay reflected a decade-old title nobody had corrected, was the easiest line to cut to make that case. She had not known what he'd built. She had not asked. Owen Diaz, the senior technician who'd worked beside Daniel for 9 years, found out by accident on a Friday afternoon while archiving old maintenance logs. Buried under a department code that hadn't existed in company records for a decade, he found the original architecture documentation for Sentinel Core, the actual blueprint of how every safety interlock in the portfolio reported back to a central system. The lead signature at the bottom of every revision read D. Cole, Chief Systems Architect. Not technician. Architect. Owen sat with that for a long time, monitor dimming to its screensaver, thinking about his own mortgage and his own 2 kids in braces and the fact that Marcus Ferris now had the authority to make anyone's job disappear the way Daniel's had. He closed the file and told himself he'd bring it up if things got worse. The kind of promise people make hoping circumstances never force them to keep it. 9 days after Daniel carried his box past the glass walls, Tower 4's freight elevator locked mid-floor during a full building inspection, doors refusing every override for 11 minutes before releasing on its own. Nobody could explain why. The panel that was supposed to tell them had been designed by a man who documented almost nothing outside his own head, because for 14 years that had seemed like an acceptable risk, right up until he was 1 email away, not 1 phone call, from ever being asked again. Renata Kessler arrived before the coffee finished brewing, still in yesterday's blazer, because someone had to be the adult in the room and lately that someone was always her, never mind that she was the one who'd signed the memo that started this. Pull his personnel file, she told the lead engineer, low enough only he heard it. "I want to know what he actually did here, not what the org chart says." What came back an hour later was thin, a title, a start date, a note about a voluntary schedule reduction 4 years earlier. Nothing about architecture. Nothing that would have told her, in the 9 minutes she'd spent signing his termination, that she was cutting the one person who understood the building's entire nervous system. Marcus leaned in the doorway, unbothered, coffee in hand. "It's an old system. Old systems fail. We'll patch it and move on." "You've said that for 3 days," Renata said. "We've lost partial function in 2 towers and we still don't know what's actually broken." She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that the moment you raised your voice in that building, people stopped listening to what you said and started watching how you said it. But something in her chest had gone cold and tight, the particular feeling of realizing a decision made in 9 minutes was about to cost far more than anyone understood at the time. That night, alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, she found a sticky note reference to legacy documentation filed under a code she didn't recognize, and pressed it to the edge of her monitor. Owen gave her half an answer over coffee the next morning, "Old team, restructured years ago, records probably in cold storage, and did not say Daniel's name. She noticed the careful way he avoided it and didn't push, though something told her the answer mattered more than he was letting on. She found the address herself through an old vendor list. She drove to Denton Street on a Saturday afternoon and parked across the street, telling herself she only meant to confirm it, no intention of getting out of the car. Through the side yard she watched him kneeling in the dirt beside a girl who had to be his daughter, guiding her hands around a trowel, patient in a way that had nothing performed about it. He laughed at something Nora said, an easy, unguarded laugh, nothing like the careful voice she remembered from a handful of meetings over the years. She did not get out of the car. She drove home and mailed a business card instead, no note, just her name and a direct line, dropped through his mailbox 2 days later like something she could call an accident if anyone asked. Daniel found the card on a Tuesday, turning it over twice before he understood what it was. Renata Kessler, Chief Operating Officer, Ferris Vertical Transit. He'd seen that name printed under the signature on his termination letter, a signature that hadn't looked rushed, hadn't looked like anything but routine. He set it in the kitchen drawer with the spare batteries and did not call. 3 days later she came in person, standing on his porch in a coat that cost more than his car payment, looking less certain of herself than he'd ever seen a Ferris executive look. "I should have called first," she said. "You could have called at all," he said. "You had my number for 14 years. Nobody used it when it mattered." She didn't flinch, which he respected, even angry as he was with the screen door propped against his shoulder. "I'm not here to apologize for the meeting. I mean, I am. But that's not why I drove out here. There's a serious problem at the plant, and I think you're the only person who can explain what's wrong with it. You fired the only person who could explain it." "I know. Then you understand why I'm not interested." She nodded, accepting it the way someone accepts a verdict they'd hoped to talk their way out of. "I'd pay you directly. Consulting rate, your terms, nothing that ties back to the company if you don't want it to." Daniel looked past her toward the street, toward the life he'd built out of the wreckage of the one he'd lost. "It's not about the money. I don't want my daughter watching her father get called back the second they need something from him. She watched me lose that job without asking why, because I never told her. I'm not going to let her watch me crawl back for it either." Margot, Renata, nodded slower this time and turned to leave. At the bottom of the steps she stopped. "For what it's worth, I didn't know who you were when I signed it. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth, and you deserve to hear it from me instead of a headline." He didn't answer, but he watched her drive off longer than he meant to. 6 days later, the portfolio's largest tenant, a hospital system leasing 4 of the 11 buildings, sent formal notice that if the safety compliance issues weren't resolved within 7 days, they would begin relocating services to a facility with a functioning maintenance record. 16 days had passed since Daniel walked out the door. The countdown that mattered now wasn't on anyone's calendar. It was printed in numbers nobody could argue with, at the bottom of a letter from a client that represented a third of the company's revenue. Marcus called an emergency committee meeting the following Monday. Owen had been asked to attend as technical lead, which meant he was the one expected to explain, in front of the chairman's son, exactly how a system that had run without failure for a decade had come apart in 16 days. He'd spent the weekend deciding whether to say what he knew, at his kitchen table, at his kids' soccer practice, in the shower where most of his real decisions got made. By Monday he'd decided that staying quiet had already cost more than speaking up ever would. "There's something you should see," he said, and opened an email dated 4 days before Daniel's termination. He read it aloud rather than paraphrase it, because paraphrasing gave people room to soften what it said. In it, Daniel had flagged in plain language that any personnel change to his role would require a minimum 90-day technical handoff, given the undocumented nature of the safety architecture tied to that position. He'd send it to Marcus directly, trusting the chain of command the way people do before they learn not to. Marcus had never forwarded it. It sat in his inbox, read and unanswered, until the meeting that ended Daniel's employment made the question moot. The room went quiet the way rooms do when people start Marcus was asked to step back from operations that afternoon, pending a full review. He didn't argue, didn't invoke his father's name the way he might have 3 weeks earlier. For the first time since Daniel's box had cleared the front door, he looked like a 28-year-old who finally understood that consequences existed and had simply been waiting their turn. The board authorized a reinstatement offer that same day, full return, full backdated title and pay, an apology in writing if he wanted one. Renata delivered it herself, finding Daniel in the yard again, this time staking a young maple sapling instead of kneeling beside Nora. "They want you back," she said. "Full title, full pay, backdated to the day you left." He straightened, brushing dirt from his knees, taking his time. "What do you want?" "Not the board. You. I want to stop lying awake wondering how many other decisions I've made the same way, on 9 minutes and half the information. That's mine to fix, not yours. But I do think the plant needs you. And I think you know it, or you wouldn't still be checking your phone every time it rings." He almost smiled at that. Caught out. They sat on the porch steps a while after that, saying little. She asked, carefully, how Claire had died. He told her simply, the way people describe things they've had to describe too many times already, an intersection 2 miles from the house, a driver who ran a light on an ordinary Tuesday morning, years that felt shorter every year instead of longer the way everyone promises they will. She didn't offer a rehearsed condolence. She just sat with it, and that, more than the offer or the apology, was what made him start to believe she might be someone worth trusting again. He called 2 nights later, after Nora was asleep, and told her yes, not because of the backdated pay, but because he'd walked the buildings in his head 100 times since the collapse hit the news, and couldn't stand the thought of watching them fail from the outside when he knew exactly how to fix them from the inside. A building that doesn't talk to the people running it isn't safe, he told her that night, the same thing he'd once told Nora over a broken garage door opener when she was 6. It's just quiet. And quiet isn't the same thing as fine. He walked back onto the floor a Monday morning 4 weeks after he'd walked off it, and the response wasn't what he expected. Technicians who'd known him for years shook his hand and held on a beat longer than a handshake usually calls for. Someone had left a chair pulled out at the morning meeting like they'd known who he really was the whole time, even when the company on paper hadn't. He ran diagnostics for 11 hours straight that first day, mapping every fault against architecture he'd never trusted paper enough to fully write down, and by evening Tower 4 came back online in stages, interlocks, then override relays, then the full safety sequence, humming the way it used to before anyone decided a title on a spreadsheet meant more than the work underneath it. Marcus found him in the control room near the end of that shift, hovering in the doorway the way a person does when they've come to say something and aren't sure they'll manage it. "I read your email again. The one I never forwarded. I've read it about 10 times this week. And you were right about all of it. I didn't ignore it because I thought you were wrong. I ignored it because forwarding it meant admitting I needed you." Daniel finally turned to face him, arms crossed loosely, not unkind but not warm either. He didn't offer forgiveness, and Marcus didn't seem to be asking for it outright. "Then don't ignore the next one," Daniel said. "That's all I actually want from you. Not an apology. Just don't do it again." It wasn't warmth, but it was honest, and Marcus took it, nodding once before he left the room, looking for the first time like a man trying to learn something instead of avoid it. Within 2 weeks, the hospital system withdrew its notice, citing the transparency about what had gone wrong and the speed of what had been done to fix it. The stock recovered most of its losses within the month, in small increments that made no headlines at all. None of it happened because of one dramatic gesture. It happened in the accumulation of small things done right, day after day, by a man the company had once decided on a spreadsheet it could do without. Owen stopped by his office one afternoon that stretch, leaning in the doorway the way half the floor seemed to do lately. He told Daniel about the maintenance file, the sticky note, the number he'd pulled up and never dialed. Daniel listened without interrupting, then said he understood why a man with 2 kids in braces didn't stick his neck out for someone else's job, and that he didn't hold it against him, but that he'd told them when it counted, and that was the part that mattered. After that, Owen made a point of bringing him coffee most mornings. An apology delivered one cup at a time instead of all at once. Renata started coming by the control room in the afternoons, ostensibly for updates that rarely took as long as the visits themselves. Neither of them announced anything. Coffee left on his desk some mornings without a word. A running joke about the vending machine that never had the flavor she wanted. Both of them staying past 6 some evenings, not because the work required it, but because neither one was in a hurry to be the one who left first. Daniel was formally named Chief Systems Architect at the end of that month, a title finally matching a decade of work nobody had bothered to write down. Nora came to the plant the day they hung the placard outside his office door, standing on her toes to read it out loud twice, like saying it made it more real. Renata crouched down to her height and asked if she wanted to see the button that brought the whole tower's system online at once, and Nora's unhesitating yes made both adults laugh in a way that had nothing forced in it. That evening the three of them ended up at Daniel's kitchen table without either adult quite deciding it in advance, Renata staying for dinner because Nora had set a third place without asking anyone first, then staying for the dishes because it felt strange to leave in the middle of them, then staying long after because nobody had said out loud that it was time to go. Later, after Nora fell asleep on the couch halfway through a movie neither adult was really watching, Daniel carried her to bed while Renata waited on the porch, arms around her knees against the cool evening air. He came back out and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I keep waiting for this to feel complicated," she said, looking at the dark street instead of at him. "It doesn't. Not the way I expected." "Give it time," he said, but he was smiling when he said it, and the smile gave the joke away before the words could land as a warning. His hand found hers on the step between them, not reaching for it exactly, just settling there, like it had been waiting for permission neither of them had thought to ask for out loud until this ordinary, unremarkable evening. Inside, the credits rolled on an empty living room, sound turned low. On the fridge, held up by a magnet shaped like a sunflower, a drawing Nora had made that week showed 3 stick figures in front of a building with a smiling sun overhead. No caption. None needed. A well-built system doesn't need anyone watching over it every second. It only needs someone who understands what happens when the weight on one side stops matching the weight on the other, and who's still there, quietly, to catch it before it falls. Neither of them had been looking for that. That was exactly why they found it. Velvet Storiez Tales.